Okay, today we have Neal Parikh, and he is a computer scientist who most recently served as director of AI for New York City. He is currently an adjunct associate professor at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, teaching a new class on AI for policymakers. Previously, he co-founded a technology startup, which was acquired after 10 years in operation. He was inaugural fellow at the Aspen Tech Policy Hub at the Aspen Institute, and he worked as a senior quant at Goldman Sachs. He received his Ph.D. in computer science from Stanford University, focusing on large-scale machine learning and convex optimization. His research has received over 25,000 citations in the literature and is widely used in industry.
Thanks a lot. So thanks for having me. This is kind of fun. This isn't kind of a weird talk. This is not the kind of talks that I'm used to doing. Honestly, to audiences like this, which are more technical, I would give you at least one equation, to be honest, or something. This is not that. So this is really sort of what an outsider's experience is like. Outsider being people like the people on this talk in this room. We spent some time in government service working on AI and AI policy kinds of issues. It's supposed to be relatively light, but it will bounce around a lot, and take it as a bit of an impressionist sort of painting in a way. So like no one thing is that important, but overall it by the end should give you a sense of what it's like. And then I'll try to leave a good amount of time for questions, and we can talk about any of these things a little bit more, or something else if you want to ask me something else, and that's totally fine too. So it's going to go in a few stages. I'll talk first a little bit about just what's going on here. Just New York City itself to set the stage of where we are, then talk about the government, and then go into a little bit of the AI stuff, and then just some sort of observations, takeaways, lessons learned. So this again, I'll go through kind of quickly. So New York City is large. There are 39 states with a smaller population. It is home to 13% of the US AI workforce. There are many sort of subsystems in New York that are also quite large and hard to manage for various reasons. So there's 1.1 million students in New York City public schools. This doesn't include staff, faculty, et cetera. There are 1 million New Yorkers living with a disability. So when you're talking about things like AI ethics, people tend to focus in the US, especially a lot on things like race and gender, but disability is actually like a very, very difficult and complicated one, partly because it doesn't have such a small and relatively well-defined taxonomy. But this is not like a niche issue, right? This is 1 million people. There's 260,000 students in CUNY. This is over 100,000 more than the Ivy League combined. What's called the GMP, which is the analog of GDP of New York City, of the New York metro area, actually, which includes some other cities around here, is $2.1 trillion. This is larger than Italy or Russia for comparisons purposes. It's around 8% of the US economy, which is a lot in this one place. And it's also very diverse. So people tend to think that, municipalities, because they're sort of lower down in the hierarchy of government, deal less with like foreign issues, which is generally true, but it's not the case in many sort of larger scale cities. So it's a very, very diverse international kind of place, and those issues are very much at the fore. So there are 3.2 million, around 40% of residents are foreign born, 50% of residents speak a language other than English at home, 25% of New York is not English proficient. Again, this is 1.8 million people, is not a niche kind of group you can sort of ignore in like the first rollout of some program or whatever. There are 100 languages available for telephonic interpretation if you call the city's customer support line, which is 311. People use this, and you can get reports from 311, which is its own agency on how many calls were made in how many languages and so on and so forth. And it's pretty wild. There are 11 official languages of New York. This is English plus what are called local law 30 languages. It is required by law that key agencies that for their key documents, not for everything, have them translated into all 11 languages. So this would be things like COVID information, health information, high school admissions. Fortunately, not anything I wrote, but quite a bit of stuff. And this can be hard in something like a rapidly changing situation like COVID, where you're constantly having to retranslate everything and put it out and so on. There are lots of challenges too. So 40% of New Yorkers are what's called digitally underconnected. So they lack sufficient access to either home or mobile broadband. Again, this limits their ability to push out stuff in like digital form, for example, as opposed to in print or in person or whatever. People tend to think of this as like a rural problem. It is not. This is a problem in every city around the world. 18% of New Yorkers lack access to both home and mobile broadband. Again, there's 1.5 million people. This is not a niche set of people. Okay, so this is kind of like a whirlwind tour of some sort of random statistics to give you a feel of what you would be stepping into. I grew up in New York and I was surprised by many of these actually. So now let's talk a little bit about the New York City government, that who is in charge of all this? And it turns out it's quite a complicated question, and it's very important because, you know, to put it in a simple way, if you're mad about something, it's important to be mad at the right person and to like figure out who to be mad at if you want to actually do anything, or if you're working in the government, you know, who to pick up the phone and try to talk to. So anyway, the city government is quite large. It floats around 300,000 people across. This is the executive branch. By like point of comparison, this is around double the size of most of the big tech companies. Same order of magnitude. Amazon is an outlier because of warehouses and retail, and they're much, much larger, more like a Walmart or something. The budget is quite large. It's a $100 billion budget, roughly around there. And this is the city's org chart. So this changes, you know, maybe it's changed since I last updated. This is from February 2022, but I'll just point out a few key points. So the top is the people of the city of New York. This is you, this is voters. Then there's the sort of top level elected positions. So going from left to right, on the left, there are these sort of strange things called borough presidents. So each of the 5 boroughs has their own president. The borough president really doesn't have any powers. It's like a weird, slightly fake job, but we have them. One of the things they do is that they appoint, not elect, the members of community boards, which can do all kinds of things like block outdoor dining and block housing and block bike lanes and, you know, all of these sorts of things. And that's really quite important, actually. So it's a sort of soft power, but it's a very real power. Then there's the comptroller, who manages the city budget or oversees it in a way. The mayor is in the middle. Then there's a strange, slightly fake thing called a public advocate. Doesn't have any formal powers. Then there is the city council. This is the equivalent of Congress. It's unicameral, which means that there's one chamber, not bicameral. So Congress has Senate and House. This just has one chamber. Okay, so there's the city council. Then there's the district attorneys. These people are in charge of criminal justice, essentially, criminal justice policy. These are separate people, right? These are separate elected officials per borough. You'll often hear people talk about the New York district attorney. There is no New York district attorney. There is a Manhattan district attorney, which is what they mean, but there's 5 of them. Law and Order is about the Manhattan district attorney, not the other district attorneys. And then there's a thing called the Independent Budget Office. Below this because the city government is so large, there's what's called a deputy mayor system, where there are these mini mayors, essentially, that oversee large subsets of the city government. And all of the departments and agencies and so on, like the fire department, you know, Department of Education, and then there's like very small ones, like the Office of Nightlife, which is like a few fun, tired people, you know, but there's like very, very large agencies. So some of these boxes are very, very small set of people. Some of them are like tens of thousands of people. And these are organized by color into these different deputy mayors. Those are not legal things. So a mayor may change around what the set of deputy mayors are, which agencies go to whom. Near the end of the de Blasio administration, one of the DMs was getting overloaded, and like my agency and the fire department were moved to a different deputy mayor, stuff like that. This can be quite important though, because it's not as easy to collaborate across the colors, across the different deputy mayor verticals. So it's not that you can't do it, but it is harder. Because all these different people have their own agendas and budgets and this, that, and the other. This I'll come back to a little bit later, but this is sort of roughly the structure of the government. However, a lot of the things that you think of as being part of the city government and the city fabric, if you will, are things that are not on that slide or actually kind of have a complicated ownership structure. So I'll just go through some of these very quickly. So like trash and sanitation, that is on the previous slide, but it's split across two agencies. There's the Department of Sanitation and there is the Parks Department. And when you see some sort of like greenaway in an intersection, it can be that the Parks Department is in charge of garbage at the greenaway and the Sanitation Department is in charge for the roads leading up to the greenaway. This can make things a headache, right? And this is, I'm talking about government, but any really sort of like very large institution, Amazon, a large hospital system, like there are analogous things that I'm sure would occur to you. Airports are very complicated. This is, the outsides are basically run by a thing called the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. This is something that is, it comes out of a 1921, it's called an interstate compact, which is a weird structure between these two states. So like Newark Airport and JFK and LaGuardia are run by the same people. And the people on those boards are appointed by the governors, not the city. So the mayor has nothing to do with this. The insides are kind of run by Department of Homeland Security because of the US border. So this would be TSA, Customs and Border Protection, people like that. Power grid, this is Con Ed. Con Ed is not on the previous slide. This is something called an investor-owned public utility. I think it might be the first thing listed on the New York Stock Exchange, another weird legal structure. Subways, this is the MTA. This is a public benefit corporation, or they call themselves that legally, right? So this also has a strange governance structure where it is really run much more by the governors, not run by the mayor. So people like to get mad at the mayor about the subways. The mayor does not control the subways. And under the de Blasio administration, when Andrew Cuomo was there, Andrew Cuomo would love screwing with Bill de Blasio. They had a huge feud by screwing things up in the subways because they would blame de Blasio and not Cuomo. Criminal justice, this is split across many different people. So there's the 5 district attorneys, there's NYPD, there's also the courts, which is a separate system that reports more to the state. There's another weird thing called the New York Criminal Justice Agency. They do pre-trial decisions, and they actually use some AI I'll talk about briefly to make recommendations to judges on letting people out on bail and stuff like that. But that's an independent thing that is like kind of the government and kind of not the government. Elections, this is New York Board of Elections. This reports to the state. This is a comically corrupt agency. I think 14% of it is related to each other. And they've got all kinds of strange rules, like 2 people have to do each job. A Democrat and a Republican. So everything is like redundant and wasteful and like this and that. But nobody cares about the Board of Elections after they get elected. So this never gets fixed. And then there's all kinds of other things like public schools, public housing, public hospitals, public colleges. There's like DOE, NYCHA, H&H, CUNY. These also all have like, they're kind of the government and kind of not the government. These are not just wonky details. Partly it's because, like I said, you kind of have to know who to get mad at or who to pick up the phone and call, but it's also that they're under different legal regimes. So I once tried to ban the use of facial recognition in public school and public housing in New York. I actually convinced everyone. The problem was that the mayor was willing to sign an executive order on something related to AI ethics, digital rights. We just had to come up with what to put in it. This is the way it works sometimes. I'll sign something. And I suggested this, and I convinced people this is a good one. Everyone was convinced, but it turns out because of this legal status, it is illegal to do that by executive order. You have to pass a law because the Department of Education is not a regular city agency, and NYCHA is also not, which is the Public Housing Authority, is also not a regular city agency. So like they're kind of in the government, kind of not in the government, but they're not subject to executive orders. So it got kicked back by the law department of all people, just on this sort of annoying technicality, but we came very close to doing that. All right, so this is just like a little bit of a sense of the New York City government. And now I'll tell you a few stories of the kinds of challenges you run to, because when you have like a PhD or a postdoc or whatever, you know, the kinds of things that you guys are doing, or even like way lower than that, you get very ambitious that, oh, you know, like I'm going to restructure the New York City subway system with semi-definite programming. And this will like hugely reduce the suboptimality of the, you know, something like this, right? But you have to understand into. So here's one, tech one. So this was the bane of my existence. This is a system called City Time. This is like the timekeeping system. So it's like when you go on vacation, how many hours you work. It's like the worst looking system you could possibly imagine. It was supposed to cost something like 50 million or 70 million, which is kind of a lot already, but okay. It was so corrupt that it ended up costing the city $700 million. And Preet Bharara, who was the US attorney, federal level at that time, took these people to court and sentenced them to 20-year jail sentences, both people in the government and at the government contractor. So sometimes when you say, oh, like the private sector would be better at this, not necessarily. This is the private sector that did this in collaboration with the government, of course, but this was a private sector contractor. Here's another one about the MTA. So there was a new NYC transit chief, Sarah Feinberg, and she wanted to clean up the MTA and make it more efficient. Sounds great, you know, like ambitious new official. And there's this very funny thing that happened because she discovered that they have no org chart, which makes it quite hard to restructure an agency. And she said she was confounded when no one was able to provide her with a full breakdown of the workforce that she has led. And there is like an amazing quote from her where she goes, "There are people who do not work here who we are paying." It is crazy. I absolutely believe there are a lot of people wandering around and no one knows who they report to. Part of the reason this is the case is because they weren't approved for a $4 million budget line item to get everyone email addresses. So they can't email these people. DOE. So I'm going to go a little faster through some of these. So DOE, this was a case where there was like a massive cybersecurity breach. Again, this is a private sector contractor. Education officials blasted Illuminate Education, California-based company behind the system, claiming it fudged cybersecurity protocols. 800,000 New York City students compromised. Wireless. There was some simple remedy. Somehow New York City's technology managers were caught completely off guard, did nothing to prepare for this Y2K-ish GPS reset that had to happen. So the wireless network that's used for things like license plate readers, traffic lights, stuff like that, went down for 10 days, which is a long time for an outage for something like that, right? So there's this kind of thing. And then there are historical things that are not sort of one-off problems with like individual systems or incompetence at an agency or a contractor, but there's these historical things. I assume everyone is familiar with the redlining here, so I won't belabor the point, but this is a real redlining map of Brooklyn from the 1930s. And you can kind of see, and anytime you want to do something at a government level or even with government data, even if you're not in the government, geography is often a part of it. You roll out pilots on a neighborhood basis, you try to figure out where to place certain resources, a park, a hospital, a clinic, this, that, but it picks up all of this stuff. So you have to go to enormous lengths to unpoison the data in one way or another, so that it's not just propagating these sort of historic examples of racism. And this is correlated with so many different things, like the average temperature because there aren't enough trees and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's sort of like general tech stuff in NYC. So now I'll talk a little bit about the AI stuff in particular. So the main sort of public artifact that we produced was writing the city's first AI strategy, which if you want to look at it, it's on my website. And I'll just go through some of the structure. I mean, essentially there had been various types of nascent efforts related to AI. So there was like the creation of, there's a mayor's office of information privacy. The city has a chief privacy officer. The city has a cyber defense agency. There's a chief cyber officer. There's a thing called used to be called an AMPO, the algorithms officer, who catalogs all of the uses of AI across the city government, other things like this. But they really wanted to take, and I was in a mayoral office also, they really wanted to take a very broad, holistic look at AI in the city government and in the city itself. So including places like this, for example, that interact with the city and are sort of city institution. So people didn't really know much about AI. So this was a fairly pedagogical document that was aimed not at the general public. It's a public document, but it was not really aimed at the general public. It was aimed at city leaders. So this might be like agency heads, mayor's offices, deputy commissioners, and also people at places like this, you know, nonprofits, civic tech, hospitals, whatever, that interact with the government. So there's this section, what is AI? So this is sort of a short intro on what AI actually is and some of the terminology. This is fleshed out significantly more in this thing at Supplement A at the end, which is what we call the New York City AI Primer, and we publish separately because it has nothing to do with New York. It's really trying to give people, that kind of audience, a working knowledge of machine learning to understand where these sorts of policy issues actually arise. That when you read in the newspaper that some system is racist, where can that come from? What is the role of data in building a machine learning model? What is a machine learning model? And trying to do this with, no formulas or code or anything like that, obviously in a way that's relatively quickly skimmable by, a senior executive kind of level. So this AI primer, many people find it useful when they have to talk to people like that. Then going back to the main part of the strategy, we took this ecosystem approach of trying to do this mapping exercise of what are all of the different types of institutions and functions that AI relates to in New York. And I'll come back to that in a second. So that was partly the city and then partly the government. And then we organized the main bulk of the strategy into this thing called findings and opportunities, where we, grouped our findings of, ongoing efforts that you could categorize as being related to AI, and opportunities that we thought, were available for future development into these 5 things. So some of them are more technical, some of them are more policy or whatever. So the first is city data infrastructure. Really has nothing to do with AI at all, but obviously it's a technical prerequisite. And it's hard to get like deputy mayor level people, again, going back to the org chart, interested in something as boring as like cleaning up city data infrastructure, having like consistent schemas and stuff like that. But you can't do these fancy things without that, right? The second is city applications. These are things where the city actually uses AI for something. Governance, so this would be, managing the city's own, overseeing the city's own use of these tools, and also things in the private sector. So, should bars be allowed to use facial recognition systems? And if so, what should the regulations be on these? Partnerships, this is a little unusual, but I thought this was very important because one of the main things that you hear about in government is capacity, that there aren't enough you people don't work for the government. You're here and then you're going to go to like, a hospital or Genentech or something. So it's quite hard to get enough people in all of these positions to do this work. And sometimes you need to do one project. It's not really a full-time job or whatever. So the only way a government is realistically going to be able to do a lot of this is through partnering with universities and other appropriate institutions for whatever it is. So this is about how to cultivate these partnerships and manage them. And then the last was business education and the workforce. So talent pipelines. How do we make sure that everyone in New York has access to good quality jobs in these areas at startups, at Google, wherever it might be? How does this relate to CUNY? How does this relate to local businesses, local business funding, et cetera? So this is a very broad document. And we interviewed a lot of people for this of all different types in the government, outside the government, and that's all documented in the supplement B. So that is kind of the overview of what the structure of the strategy looks like. I don't have time to go through all of it, obviously, but you can ask me questions. I'll just show a few things here. So this is a diagram of mapping the city government's relationship. So these are all city agencies on the left, and their relationships to different aspects of AI and AI policy. So on the left, you'll see a list of agencies, and you'll see they're kind of a lot. It's not just technical agencies, there's dozens of them. And on the left is the acronym or the internal slang that government likes acronyms. So these are the acronyms. And then the full names. And then on the right are 4 different like major buckets of things that are about AI in some way, and then mapping them across. So the top one is governance and policy. So this includes things like oversight of city use, policy and legislation, laws, right? Even data governance. Then there's applications, which has these different subsets. There's things about, dealing with communities, dealing with residents, resident outreach, and then there's like business stuff we lumped into one big thing. But you can see that there's quite a lot of people related to any one issue, because many issues that come up may involve a mix of these different things, right? It involves businesses, and it involves an application, and it involves some policy thing, but there's different agencies that are dealing with this. So like the Department of Finance is not part of AI policy, but they run significant AI systems and so on and so forth. So this took a lot of time actually to try to find this, but you often have to do this kind of mapping exercise when you come into the institution and are trying to figure out what's going on. This is the same diagram, but mapped against the org chart that I showed you before. This is a slightly older org chart. So if you look at the details, they've moved around to some DMs in the new administration and stuff. But basically in red or highlighted any agency listed on the previous chart. So you can see that not only is it kind of a lot of agencies, they're all over the place in the city government. And in many cases, a lot of these deputy mayors would not even be aware that like 7 agencies that are under their purview are doing various things related to AI, and they need to learn about it. That's kind of the point of this slide. And partly as a result of, I mean, I can't take credit for this, but sorry, go ahead.
Some of the chat saying there cannot see your screen anymore. Stop sharing.
Oh, I can stop and reshare. Is that working? What just happened? Not 100% sure why it's doing that. No, you can't do that. I have to get out of this first. That's why. Do this in a particular order. See this?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. All right, so this is the org chart. And like I said, these things are strewn across the city government. Actually, as part of the Adams administration, they moved together a lot of these technology agencies, like the Mayor's Office of Information Privacy, the Algorithms Officer, the Cyber Officer too, cybersecurity people. They were in a different deputy mayor bucket than me, for instance, which was annoying. So they screwed up some of the reorg, but it's better now on a relative basis. So these are just a few examples of actual applications that the city uses. These are 3, I think, of the 6 that are cataloged in the strategy. And the point of having these 6 was that they're all qualitatively different. And it should be sort of intuitively obvious that the kinds of governance or approach or thinking about this would need to clearly be quite different for all of these. So you can't have a one-size-fits-all across all of these types of systems. So this is the Cyber Defense Agency. They're quite sophisticated. This is like US Cybercom, if you know what that is, but they only do defensive work. They don't do offensive operations like the US one does. So they operate a ML-based intrusion analysis system. This is classic large-scale machine learning, right? That you would think about when you think about machine learning. This is 2.3 petabytes of historical training data. This comes from basically the city's network infrastructure. This is like device data. Process over 11 billion events each day, hundreds of thousands of predictions per second, runs 24/7 with good uptime. And this is something that is obviously not replacing a person, right? This is a real-time service that's doing intrusion detection. It's also not something where stuff like fairness, stuff like that is remotely relevant. This is not something that it's fine to disclose it to some extent, but this is not something that you do like community board meetings over and ask people their opinions. That would be stupid, frankly. That's not the case for all of these systems. Then there's something that's getting a little bit closer to home and people. So there's Department of Finance, which sounds like the most boring agency in the city government, has a thing called the Property Valuation Group. They value over 1 million parcels annually for real estate tax purposes and generate taxable market values exceed $1 trillion. So if you're wondering where does the $100 billion come from, this is where it comes from. So this is very, very important for paying for all of the other services. So they actually do stuff that many people would be surprised by, that they do aerial LiDAR mapping, so 3D mapping of the whole city periodically, and then they do stuff like change detection. So here, this is by Central Park. If you see on the top right, Columbus Circle, Central Park kind of area, and the new buildings are highlighted in red. And then those things get pumped into further statistical models. They have a team around the size of this room that are stats people, like proper stats people that have all kinds of statistical models. They also do street level LiDAR to automatically classify buildings as like, do you have a walk down basement or not? Is this a walk up or not? And those things are all taxed differently. So they do this kind of stuff. So people are not the input, but like you'll get a bill based on stuff like this. This is often the kind of stuff that you talk about when you talk about AI ethics. This is people. People are the input. But it's a happy story, unlike most of them. So this is or a happier story anyway. In 2019, an agency called the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, which has proper criminologists and statisticians and those kinds of people, MOCJ and CJA, which is one of those things I mentioned as being kind of the government, kind of not the government, criminal justice agency. They partnered, again, this is an important example of partnerships, with University of Chicago's crime lab and various other like think tanky kinds of consultancies that do behavioral economics kind of work to revise the city's pretrial risk assessment algorithms. So they're very clear actually in that this is all documented in like a 55 page report. It's worth reading because they do lots of clever things to get an ethical outcome. And one of the things is they have a very clear sense of what the goal is. So they say maintaining high court appearance rates. So this is about whether you keep someone in Rikers Island, a very dangerous place, to guarantee they will show up to their court date. They're not convicted of anything yet, right? This is basically to make sure the person will show up. So what they're trying to figure out is what they call FTA, failure to appear. That's what the assessment process is, probability of failure to appear. So they were happy with how many people were showing up. So maintain that, that's the constraint. And then the objectives are twofold, to use like optimization lingo. So reduce unnecessary use of pretrial detention. So don't put people in Rikers if you don't need to, and reduce racial disparities, which were too high. What's important here is that partly this is clear from the get-go, but these are not technology goals. These are not AI goals. These are criminal justice policy goals. So you have to have those people in the room, and that's why the system ends up working. It's not designed to just sort of predict what judges would do on average. That's how you get all this bad stuff. So that's just an example. There are many details about that system. For example, it's designed to be run on paper. It's designed to be recalculable by hand in court and it's designed to be disputable. So either lawyer can look at the input variables, of which there's like 10 on purpose again, and has had 2 prior infractions, not 3 prior infractions or whatever, and they can hand recalculate. And they constrain the weights in the model, it's a linear regression model basically, to be integers, to facilitate, hand recalculation and stuff like that. There's many, many other details that are quite interesting about how they did this. They had 2 separate teams design the models based on the data, and then they red teamed each other and checked that, they both came to similar conclusions and stuff like that. But it's a rare example of a really well done sort of ethical, policy-oriented, social sort of AI application. Okay, so now this is just like a bunch of like random observations and takeaways, and I'll go through these sort of quickly, and then we'll stop and do questions. So one is AI policy. So this is kind of also the premise of the strategy, right? So AI policy includes a huge number of important topics, including things like immigration, international trade, business development, talent pipelines. Is often too narrowly interpreted as being just about regulations and just about algorithmic fairness issues in particular, and also like a specific subset of government and corporate systems, like facial recognition at a police department is like a huge amount of ink. It's not unimportant, but it's not as important as its relative coverage would suggest. Related to this, what I would call regulatory solutionism is actually as common as techno-solutionism. So techno-solutionism you may have heard of, which is sort of people who just, Silicon Valley kind of people basically, who just think, oh, we'll just like build more technology and fix all of social problems. This is kind of reductive, but so is thinking that, oh, I can just write some regulation to ban this or ban that, and like that is going to fix this. And these like very broad policy frameworks that try to deal with all of AI in the same kind of way are also kind of a form of techno-solutionism in a way. A lot of regulations are needed, but are or likely will end up being bad. And there are some reasons for this. So one is people who write these and push for them often fail to consider like reversal of political valences. What I mean by that is like the opposite party or someone with an opposite opinion becomes in charge of the thing that you did. And now the stuff that you wrote looks quite different, like the powers that you created, the system you created to oversee something. So you have to be quite careful about this. Poorly are another problem, that AI is quite a hard thing to define. But when you put that into a law of like what kinds of systems are subject to this, it can become really tricky. And this has created a lot of fights in government lobbying and stuff like that. And the last one is market dynamics, that sometimes like if you do something like create a requirement that something be audited, that sounds good, but what you're also creating is a unregulated market actually for the people providing the audits. So sometimes people who want to do the audits are the ones that are pushing for that thing, and they'll rubber stamp it, because if you can choose and it isn't clearly defined what that audit actually produces or looks like, or who is qualified to do it, then it ends up being like a race against the bottom, right? That you can do any kind of audit and say, well, we were audited. And this kind of stuff absolutely happens. Okay. The impediments to implementing better policies are often operational. They're not ideological. Sometimes, of course, they are ideological, but in many cases, they're not. And work in like academic AI ethics and activist AI ethics often ignores this completely and makes these sort of unimplementable and impractical suggestions. So it's not actually the case. I mean, it's not exactly what I'm talking about here, but take the example that I gave of banning, facial recognition in these various parts of the city. People did not have an objection to that. It's like, how do you actually do it? That was the issue. And in other cases, if you want to, let's say, change procurement policy and you want people to review all these different aspects of a system before the city procures it, who's going to do that? Where does the budget come from? Those are the actual questions. It's not hard to just write some white paper and say there should be AI audits. Like anybody can do that. That's like 2% of the work, basically. Similarly, many perceived problems related to AI systems and that get reported to be about AI systems, not really about AI, not AI issues at all. They're downstream effects of older problems that are more traditional in things like civil service hiring procedures, like union rules, pension rules, existing policies. Give a concrete example of this. I talked to a quite senior guy in NYPD as part of doing the strategy research, and I asked him, how do you decide whether to build something in-house or outsource it with buy some external product? Immediately he said, it's pensions. It's pension system. He said the pension requirements and liabilities are so high that we basically try not to build things in-house because hiring a person is a huge headache. So unless it's someone that's going to walk around the street or something like that, we try actually not to do it, especially in these technology kinds of areas. So he said we do a little bit of that, but it's a pension thing you have to reform. That requires very different expertise. It's a very different kind of fight. Here's another one. Again, these are in no particular order. The lack of will to confront and navigate inherent trade-offs in systems and policies. This is a major impediment to actually affecting positive change, especially when things are important enough to hit the political level and political appointee level. Because as I'm sure you all know, everything in AI ethics is about, really any ethics, but we're talking about AI here, involves some kind of trade-off. That if you want the thing to become more fair, it might become less accurate. This might be not appropriate for a medical diagnosis system, for instance. And you really have to think about that. Think about its relationship to privacy, to accuracy, to transparency, and so on. But the politician does not want to say this. They want to say, we care about fairness and we care about privacy. That doesn't work. So this is actually a huge headache in trying to get them to accept and work with this technical reality, because it's too politically unpalatable for them to say something like this. We spent a huge amount of time arguing with people about that. This one, things like participatory methods, community engagement, these have become very in vogue. The people talk about this a lot, and they think that this will produce better AI systems. It's sometimes key, but you have to be kind of careful that this is not done in a way that avoids essentially what I would call tech NIMBYism, or overly uncompromising stances. Sometimes that can relate to trade-offs as well, but it can relate to other things. So if you talk to people that are used to more traditional types of activism, like housing policy, climate policy, transportation, biking, things like that, congestion pricing, they will say it is a nightmare if you try to go talk to these community boards because they just want to say no to everything. I remember a very funny instance that happened in my own community board where outdoor dining is quite popular. Regular New Yorkers is not so popular among the kinds of people that are willing to serve on community boards. So this woman said, and this is sort of an encapsulation of this whole thing. She goes, I haven't heard one argument for why we would allow this, other than the fact that people enjoy it. It's like, it's actually like a very good reason to do something in a place that people live. But you have to be kind of careful when to use this and when not to use it. And even when you must use it, it's not so easy to essentially elicit like informed opinions and then combine the different people's opinions into sort of a social welfare kind of policy that doesn't annoy too many people and is actually sort of consistent with expert opinion as well. So this is actually quite hard. This actually disappointed me a lot and surprised me a little bit. So even when there is actually a lot of will and ability to fix sort of basic problems, you often can't prioritize these projects because there's not enough media interest in them. And of course, the media interest is to some extent a byproduct of voter interest, but it's also just the media interest. So there's things like digitizing old records that are, you know, that are New York City records that would be very useful to have in digital form for various kinds of technology, machine learning, whatever sorts of projects. But it's too boring to write a press release about. So often it's like you have to come up with a project that where it is possible to release a press release, or someone won't approve it at some higher level. So this is actually kind of a huge headache because there are people that are willing to do that boring work because they know it benefits the government, benefits the community and society and so on, but it doesn't get approved. This one is org charts like the one I showed you. These are themselves policy and they get sort of under-analyzed and under-examined. And this is actually a big issue at big tech companies where they have struggled to figure out, where does AI fit in the org chart? Is there like an AI team in every product team? You know, what exactly are they in charge of? How do you write the job descriptions? What are the job requirements? Do the researchers control policy questions? Does the policy shop only do that? They all have different answers, and this is all new, so it's actually not easy. So, but this is something that is worth actually analyzing and thinking about. Which I say here, good organizational design for AI policy is a huge and underexplored open area. And I'm sure working in a hospital, you know, these kinds of questions come up quite a lot. This is kind of a weird one, and I might kind of close it. Researchers and advocates, they typically think in terms of population statistics, but the agency staff often think in terms of like individual human beings, the equivalent of like an individual patient. And I'll give you an example. So I was talking to Children's Services, and they had some system that was like no joke of a system. So the output of the system, they basically, someone will go into your house if there's some domestic disturbance involving a kid. They will ask you 80 questions or so. The question answers are rated 1 through 4, low through very high. And then the output of the thing, this is not a machine learning system. This is a manual kind of thing they do. And then the output of the overall thing is 1, 2, 3, or 4. 1 is low. So low is nothing is wrong. We dump you out of the system and leave you alone. 4 is child removal. They will take your child away immediately. 3 is high, that they will sue you and take you to court to take the kid away, or potentially take the kid away. 2 is medium, that's everything else. So the stakes are very high for something like this. And there are some confusion matrix, right, that you could calculate of when you make a mistake. So I asked them, the people of the agency, I said, are you more concerned about, forget about 4, 4 is sort of hardcore, but if you just take low, medium, high, are you more concerned about doing high when it should be low, or vice versa? Now, if you asked a researcher, they would say, we're much more concerned about high than low, because they think of that as over-policing, right? And if you actually look at the overall population statistics, these correlate heavily with certain like racial categories, income categories, and so on, neighborhoods too. There's a red line. But these people said the opposite. They said, we're concerned about doing low when it should be high. And I said, why? They said, well, because if you do anything above low, all kinds of other things happen. So if there really is a mistake, it should get caught by like a judge or somebody else, because there's many subsequent processes. But if you do low, they're just gone. And if there was a kid in trouble and I could have done something and I didn't, I just kind of couldn't live with myself. Now, one can debate all this, but this is how they think, right? And those individual decisions often sort of add up and aggregate to something where you might look at sort of agency level statistics and say, this is not like the kind of outcome that we want overall. But I think to make progress on these kinds of questions, you really have to be able to understand where they're coming from. And this also applies absolutely to like detectives and other kinds of social services, all kinds of things, that the mentality they're coming from is quite opposite. I don't really know what to do about this, but I do think it is important for especially people like you, and especially people who think about like clinical things, and people who spend less time actually on direct clinical things and don't see patients and just work with data sets, to be aware of this if you're trying to affect policy change. Okay, last thing is just to step back from all of these fire hose of details. Does anyone know what this is from? Anyone old enough? Well, it's from 1936. Anyone a film nerd? I guess not. So this is a Charlie Chaplin movie from 1936, silent film called Modern Times. It's a very famous movie. And I recommend everyone watch it. It's a classic film, but also it is about exactly these same issues. And it goes back to 1936 and sort of the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, warehouse automation and things like that. So on the left is like a very famous scene where he literally gets swallowed up by the machine that he is supposed to work on. On the top right is workplace surveillance. So this is a case where he's taking a bathroom break and there's a huge screen in the bathroom, and that's the boss who comes on to yell at him and tells him to get back to work. So if you read any of these like Amazon workplace surveillance warehouse stories, this is the thing that goes back almost 100 years. And the last one is also like robotic automation in a warehouse, where this is a famous thing called a feeding machine, where to let the workers be able to work more hours, there's an automated feeding machine. And of course, it's a Chaplin movie, so the thing goes haywire and starts smacking him with a corn and all this sort of stuff. But it's important to understand like which of these are actually quite old debates and which parts are really new and which parts are not. And where the problems are when you're diagnosing these, because if it's appropriate terminology, I guess, for this building, but if you, without a correct diagnosis, you cannot have appropriate care. But anyway, I'll stop there and happy to take your questions. Thanks.
This is all very interesting and very practical. So my question is, so it seems like you had a lot of different kinds of jobs, like you went like quant and then all those stuff. How did you kind of end up at government and not?
Well, I ran out of the other things. So no, I'm just joking. No, the reason was it was sort of confluence of a few different things. I mean, if I'm being blunt, I started to become much more concerned with like the political environment and issues with sort of just basic functioning of the government after 2016 and that election. So then I was sort of more attuned to it. Then there was a natural point where I wanted to get out of my company day to day, because I was spending a lot of time on like CEO type things, and I felt I was getting rusty with AI and machine learning and whatnot. And it was just like I have a lot of training in it, and it was just dumb to not be part of that conversation. So when I left the company, I was sort of looking around for what's been going on in the field since I was last active in it a few years ago. And one of the things, not the only interesting thing, but one of the things was like a big increase in interest in AI ethics, AI policy, responsible AI, things like that. So I just found this program because I wanted to do something that was practical. So I wasn't so interested in just sort of writing research papers about it. Some of the research papers are very good, some of them are not, and will kind of like not go anywhere. But there was this fellowship program at the Aspen Institute for people, relatively senior technology people who want to learn about the policy process, designed as an accelerator. So it's sort of like Y Combinator, but for policy, tech policy. And you go to San Francisco for a few months and you hear from lots of speakers from the White House or governor's office or whatever, and do some project and get to know people. And coming out of that, this weird job was posted. So I was looking at mostly non-government things, but then partly I'm from New York, so that was sort of appealing. And I also started to feel like a lot of people complain about the government, or they complain about these things, but very few people with technical backgrounds are willing to put their money where their mouth is, and just like, well, let's see what happens if I actually try to do this. Like, where are the problems? A few people have done this to great effect, but not that many. Partly don't make any money, which is a real impediment, especially for like more junior kinds of folks. so I wanted to try, and so it was just sort of a confluence of certain interests and the availability of this odd, kind of very broad job, and just trying to say, if you like really do it for real, like put up or shut up kind of attitude, and it was a good experience. Very frustrating, but good experience.
You talk a lot about trade-offs, and
Yeah.
I think sort of the stereotype is that within policy, both on national, state, and city levels, is that people don't listen to staffers, especially if they're like talk about maybe it might be because of its election cycle or like national security or whatever. We've talked about different approaches, either maybe like get media attention or like pressure voters or whatever. Is that something that we as technologists should consider, or is our job as technologists just propose good ideas and pray that it works out?
No, I think it's a very good question. I think that you have to use a variety of tools, and you have to be able to figure out which kind of tool is appropriate in which situation. So in some cases, writing an op-ed in like the New York Times, that might be the right tool. In other cases, it's not the right tool. And if you're in the government, of course, your set of tools is different. Like you can't just write your own op-ed criticizing your own government. That's not allowed. So, but you have other tools that you wouldn't have if you weren't inside. So I would think about all of those tools. I would also think it's very important to follow through. Whatever that follow through looks like, you can't just like put out some idea and then wash your hands of it. That is useless. That will not go anywhere. And I think, frankly, that applies to lots of stuff that is regular research that isn't policy oriented anyway. It's like you can write some paper, but if there's like no software to reproduce it, people can't use the method, like it's too hard to implement, you don't show them how to do it, like no one's going to use it. You're not going to get any citations, even if that's like the angle you care about, right? So I think a skill you have to develop is learning some of these wonky things that I pointed out about the structure of the government, the right people to talk to, and then you have to try to kind of get inside their head of what is this person's set of priorities, because they're not an AI expert. They probably don't have a technical bone to pick with you. They just think the side effect of the thing you're suggesting is something they can't handle for whatever reason, rightly or wrongly. So actually be a larger design space where you can come up with something that is equally technically acceptable or almost as technically acceptable and correct, but does match the thing that they want. And if you can come up with those and they go, oh, okay, fine. Like, let's do that then, great. Like, it's not that they don't want to do that, but you have to have that kind of strategic thinking where you have to understand where they're coming from. And it may be a range of different priorities that, oh, if you do it this way, we can say this in public. They're like, great, because I really want to be able to say that. So if it can be a good thing and let them do what they want, that's the game of it, I would say. But I think in other situations where you're on the outside, there's many other tools like, op-eds and so on and so forth. And I do think that, scientists, people like us have some responsibility. You don't have to go work there for, some period of time. But I think it's important.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So exciting, all of this.
Okay.
I wish we had way more time than we do.
Sure.
You talked.
I didn't know this would be remotely interesting to this audience, by the way. So I'm glad you like it.
You talked about. You touched on how there's a lot of emphasis on regulation and fairness, and that sort of makes sense to me as someone who has paid a lot of attention to that myself, but also because they seem like sort of zero order things to handle as we try and embrace AI technology in every aspect of life, right? I'm wondering though, if you could talk a little bit more about the support for innovation side that comes out of your office and sort of any engagement in particular related to healthcare, like with the Department of Health and Medical Hygiene, any kind of projects you work on, any challenges related to that? So
I don't work for the city government anymore, by the way, so I don't speak for the city anymore, which is why I mouthed off a lot here. I wouldn't be able to say this kind of stuff otherwise. So I don't do any of that. Frankly, there was nothing with DOH, MH when I was there, because I was there through COVID. So they just had their hands full. They were doing that, There is a kind of fun thing that they use, which is disclosed as part of the algorithms report or whatever, which is that they use a binary classifier on Yelp reviews as an early warning food disease detector. So there's things like that, right? Also not a case with like significant fairness or ethics issues. So there was not stuff like that, but I think there are quite a lot of things on the non-regulatory side that one could do. So the city has the Economic Development Corporation, another weird thing, not exactly the government. They have much nicer offices for one thing. They're a bit of a real estate slush fund. That would be the negative way of describing it. They pay for things like the ferry, they pay for other economic development stuff, but they've got a thing called LifeSci NYC, which is like $1 billion commitment to life science companies, giving them office space, other equipment. I don't remember all the details, but you can look this up. So that's an example where the city made a significant economic development investment. And there's things around having AI clouds for researchers, and Columbia is part of a thing that's being done at the governor's office level. There's a federal one, the EdAIRR. This is the AI research resource. This is trying to build a, Google style, Google scale AI cloud for researchers to use. Those kinds of projects are very important, and like good people have worked on those that have nothing to do with regulation at all, right? It's actually getting at the regulation, potential regulation from a different angle, which is that we can't analyze these huge systems effectively in a university context because there isn't enough computational resource. So having the federal government or the state government step in, have some sort of public-private consortium, whatever it may be, these are quite influential things. There's another one being spun up. I think the physical hardware is being housed at Cornell Tech, but it is like a bunch of like H100s and chips like that that are specifically for public interest and civic tech kind of people to use. So there are these kinds of resources out there, and the funding for them comes from different places. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think using those things and being aware of them, and also like if you want, and it's your inclination, working on those kinds of policy things is very important. It's just as important as the regulations.
Yep. This question on Zoom.
Oh, sure.
David, if you want to go ahead. We can't hear you, David.
No. Someone else had one up here.
Yeah.
Or the chat, yeah.
We'll take it under
I was just wondering, do kind of something you were just saying, which was about compute resources and things like that, because a lot of stuff that we've been seeing, especially recently in AI development, has been models getting bigger, requiring more data, requiring more compute resources, all of that. And so I was wondering what your experience has been with, I imagine, kind of trying to toe a line between getting good results, realistic results for the data that you have, and also like staying within budget constraints.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually important. People get obsessed with these LLMs and deep learning models. This stuff has almost no impact whatsoever on things that like the government does, actually. So it will in certain places, but this stuff, all of it is linear and logistic regression, more or less. And those things will not change anytime soon. For reasons of transparency, for other kinds of reasons, it's insufficient. There's another thing that the city government uses to monitor the bills, energy bills that it pays. And so they take information about the buildings, the weather, this is highly predictable. And to make sure that they're invoiced for the correct amounts, there was some group paying, having to go through tens of thousands of these bills manually. So they have a simple little binary classifier. 2 people did it on one computer. So this idea that everything requires huge amounts of data, like distributed systems, even these modern framework like TensorFlow or whatever, they actually did use TensorFlow. They didn't have to really. This is completely wrong. And I think this has been a side effect of media emphasis on these kinds of things, where you can get a distorted sense of the systems that are actually out there. Now, in something like medical imaging, you do need to use, something like a convolutional neural net or whatever, but in a lot of them, they don't. So I think that computational resources, data resources are far less important than people think for lots of stuff that's very important and already deployed, actually. And in other cases, sometimes you can get the funding. So like partly because the Cyber Defense Agency was newer and various other reasons, they had a non-trivial budget. And so like for the large amounts of data they process, but that thing I think is still, it's a binary classifier, some kind of ensemble model. It's not using the ChatGPT kind of stuff. So people just don't use it, and irritate people on Twitter sometimes. I'm saying like everything's like linear and logistic regression, like not the thing that you're doing for anything actually important, like in healthcare, criminal justice. Those things are not using these techniques, and so keep that in perspective, I would say. Oh, this is good question. None that I know of, but they're doing a very thorough analysis of it, partly because this has been done in part by economists and social sciences. So they're trying to do a like formal causal analysis to be able to assess that, these changes, because there were other things that happened in the same time. There was COVID, there were actual other changes to criminal justice, like law in New York, bail reform, stuff like that. So they're trying to do a formal causal analysis to determine the exact impact of it, but they got thousands of people out of jail, informally, and they succeeded with this. They got thousands and thousands of people out of Rikers Island. And this actually goes back to kind of your question, that this is a 10 variable linear regression model. What's the impact that you kind of care about? It's another thing that MockJ actually did, where they were trying to figure out why people don't show up for their court dates. The traditional view has been to be more punitive, so to increase whatever the punishment is for that. They found that this actually doesn't work at all. So like that's not the reason people are not showing up. What they actually did, it wasn't even an ML system, so I don't talk about it here. It's literally they redesigned the form to make it easier to read, and they sent out SMS reminders for when the person would show up. I think they had 30,000 arrest warrants removed from this, and they got like 20,000 people out of jail. And that was done in a formal field experiment that was published in Science, so it's like top tier academic publication as well. I mean, you cannot get a better thing than that. And it is not even a model, so don't get like tunnel visioned by the design space here if what you care about is the impact and not like using some method or something. Yeah.
So I have a question for the trade-off between the accuracy and privacy or some kind of access in industry. I want to really take a different attitudes towards a kind of trade-off where you see like government. Because you say like government will many cases will be happiness, but I think maybe for some industries such as some high-tech companies, they may care more about the revenue. So I wonder what's the role of a kind of AI access in their point of view in the industry.
Sorry, are you asking about the government or you're talking about industry?
About industry, how the industry do this kind of trade-off. Do they care more about the revenue or the accuracy instead of the happiness or privacy?
Well, it depends who it is, right? And it depends what procurement processes they have to go through to actually get their thing bought. So there's a sepsis detection system where it was now discovered it doesn't work at all. And it's being used in hundreds of hospitals. It just doesn't work, forget about fairness or anything. And so that's a case where accuracy is going to impact their revenue in a major way. So even if you think of it as sort of downside protection, you don't want to be in the news with some racist thing or some calling Black people gorillas like Google did. You don't want this. This is not good for revenue or your brand or anything like that. It is true that the trade-offs are different in a government agency, which doesn't have they have a budget, but they don't have concepts of revenue, where of course the company wants to make money, but there are lots of ways to make money. I mean, for example, Apple cares a lot about privacy and they use it as a competitive tool, not just as a constraint that is sort of holding them back. I mean, it causes some trade-off where it's if you talk to people who do ML at Apple, they're it can be, it's not a joke, it's not a marketing thing. It can be kind of hard to get data of certain types and get permission from the privacy board at Apple to use some of this to build a model. But they're quite serious about it. And they use this as a, regulatory negotiating point with government authorities. They use it as a cudgel against Facebook and other competitors. So there's actually quite a lot of things you can do navigating that trade-off curve, even if you're sort of trying to mint money.